Moderator. I'm a technical director in the Center for Partnerships and Innovation, or CPI as we call it. We certainly welcome particularly our members from NARUC, but if you are not a member or not familiar, NARUC is the group that represents the public utility commissions and their staff across the country and in several U.S. territories. And within NARUC, the Center for Partnerships and Innovation is our technical assistance group, where we provide staff and commissioners with resources, with strategies, with expertise to help inform their decision making. Our work is funded largely by cooperative agreements with various offices within DOE and also with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And we're very grateful for their support for this. Among the offices that support us are the Grid Deployment Office, the Office of Electricity, and the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Innovation webinars are one of the ways that we support our members, and you can find dozens of past webinars on our website. And that usually includes a recording and speaker presentations, and that's why we are recording today's presentation. You'll be able to refer back to it later once it's posted in a couple of weeks. In another couple slides here, I've got a list of upcoming events that I'd like to share with you. This is not, you should not be expected to quickly jot these down. You can find them all on our website. You can see the address there, and we will put that link into the chat so that you can look for events and resources that you find interesting and relevant to your work. I did want to highlight a couple of things that are coming up very quickly next week. On Monday, we have a meeting of our Energy Resources and the Environment Committee, where we'll be talking about energy efficiency, particularly from a winter fuel consumption lens, looking at gas utility programs and weatherization. And later in the week, we have a meeting of our Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group, which is a joint project that we do with our friends at NASIO, who represent the state energy offices. And that's going to be about scaling demand flexibility with software. And we'll hear from some software providers who focus on that space. And then, of course, lots of upcoming in-person events, including our big winter meeting in DC next month, as well as some in-person trainings on a variety of topics. So we hope you will review those and think about them and think about attending. And I do need to say, though, that some of these things are members only. So please, if you're here not from our membership, please be mindful of that. We like to try to make things as widely available as possible, but sometimes our funding and other constraints require us to limit it to members. So moving along to the content for today, we have great presentations. We will certainly have time for Q&A after the presentations, so please do feel free to use the Q&A feature. Don't use the chat, please. Please only use that to contact us as hosts and panelists if you've got a technical issue. Use the Q&A for your questions, and please feel free to put them in at any time while you're thinking of them. You don't have to wait. So at this point, I am really honored to introduce Commissioner Sarah Freeman of the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission to moderate the webinar today. She has served NARUC in wonderful capacities in the past as a board member and as chair of our subcommittee on education and research, and she always brings enthusiasm and curiosity to our educational offerings. So I'm really delighted that she agreed to help lead the discussion today. Commissioner Freeman.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for those kind words. It's always a pleasure to work with you and Jessica and the rest of the CPI team at NARUC. I'm very excited about today's webinar, and I'll kick us off by doing brief introductions, bios of each of our panelists. First, JP Carvallo. JP is a research scientist in the Energy Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. His research areas at the lab focus on long-term power system planning, integration and planning of distributed energy resources and EVs, and reliability and resilience valuation. Devi Glick and Shelley Kwok are both with Synapse Energy Economics. Devi is a senior principal there and an expert in power sector economics. She has extensive regulatory experience in more than 20 states, as well as the Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. In the course of her work, Devi develops in-house electricity system models and performs analyses using industry standard electricity system models, including Plexos, Aurora, and Encompass. Shelley is a senior associate at Synapse, where she consults on a variety of topics related to the electric sector and building sectors. Her areas of expertise range from resource planning and power plant economics to building decarb and energy efficiency. Shelley also has experience using electric sector capacity expansion models to evaluate different integrated resource plans and develop alternative scenarios. And finally, Phillip Popoff. Phil is the Director of Resource Planning Analytics at Puget Sound Energy. In this role, Phil leads the development of long-haul transmission strategies to integrate high-quality renewable resources for PSE customers, and he also oversees efforts in self-build generation alternatives. We're so excited to have the four of you with us today on this webinar, and I know you've worked out how you'll be handling the slideshow presentation for the report, and with that, I'll turn it over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Freeman, for the introduction. My name is Devi Glick, and I will get us started here and introduce the presentation, the best practices in resource planning that we are going to be reviewing today. So I'm very excited to be part of the team that worked on this report. This is a follow-on of a best practices report that Synapse and RAP did about 10 years ago. And our goal with this is to really highlight how best practices have changed over the past decade and to outline useful best practices for the current electricity system. When advancing the slides, a slide or two. This best practices report, it has 50 best practices, a number that we kind of happened upon by accident, which was a nice even number, but it is a lot. So we have tried to come up with a checklist to organize the best practices and provide a useful way for the users, for commissioners, for utilities to go through the checklist as you're going through the IRP process. So we break our best practices down into categories based on how an IRP is conducted. So stakeholder engagement, resource adequacy, modeling inputs, designing scenarios and sensitivities, running the model, evaluating portfolio and modeling results and communicating those results. And then we end with a couple of best practices on integrating the IRP process with other proceedings. On the next slide, we have developed a diagram since there are many complicated parts of an IRP and the best practices cover many parts of the IRP. We found it useful to visualize where the best practices fell within the IRP process. So as you can see, we have stakeholder engagement at the bottom that we'll start with, which occurs throughout the entire IRP process. On the left, we have model inputs. So we'll talk about load forecasting, about supply side resources, demand side resources, market interactions, fuel and commodity prices, and integration with transmission. Then we'll go on to scenario design, regulatory requirements, and sensitivities. And as you can see, the process isn't static though. There are interactions, there's iteration between, you get to the modeling and the next row, the orange row of production cost modeling and capacity expansion modeling and resource adequacy assessments. And there's iteration in the modeling steps. Resource adequacy modeling is used for inputs to create inputs on capacity accreditation, on system resource adequacy. And finally, in the far right, you'll see evaluating portfolio results, communicating results, and a short-term action plan. So moving on to the next slide, one more. The first section that we'll talk about today is stakeholder engagement. And in the report, we outline a number of best practices for stakeholder engagement. Many of these in our first best practice are relatively universal to not just IRPs, but any sort of public process. So I won't spend too much time on those. They focus on prioritizing transparency and removing barriers to participation. One that I want to highlight, though, that we outline is the importance of establishing processes and norms and timelines to collect feedback for stakeholders and for the utilities to respond to the feedback that stakeholders provide. Our second best practice focuses on engaging technical stakeholders in the IRP process. So this best practice really highlights the value and role that technical stakeholders can provide to the IRP process, but the tools and the data access that they need in order to provide value and actually engage. So we outline recommendations on the utilities providing certain types of input data, access to technical utility staff to answer questions about how data is used, post-processing and pre-processing spreadsheets, and even software licenses. So as an example, the Arizona Commission required Arizona Public Service and Tucson Electric Power as part of the last two IRP processes to provide licenses to interveners, provide trainings, and that really facilitated engagement of technical stakeholders in the modeling process. I'll now turn it over. I think it's JP is going to take us through the next few slides.
Yeah, thanks, Devi. I'm going to start this model input section with what's probably one of the hot topics these days, load forecasting and DER forecasting. And as Devi mentioned, you have to bear in mind that, of course, we can't cover all 50 best practices, so I'm going to do a relatively summarized version of some of our practices just to give you awareness. And I also want to highlight that Phillip from Puget Sound Energy will be showcasing examples of how some of these best practices are being actually implemented by Puget Sound in their IRP. So you will see us passing back and forth between the Synapse and LVNL team and Phillip as we use their actual experiences as part of examples for these best practices. On the load and DER forecasting, we set up at around 6 best practices that cover a number of areas related to how to examine historical data and how much we can rely on historical data. This is particularly important in a world where load is starting to grow significantly with types of end users that are new and that have not existed in the past. The same reason we extracted across the 50+ IRPs we examined a number of methods and approaches for load forecasting that we lay out. In particular, we focus on how to incorporate load flexibility into electrification forecasts. We're offering an entire best practice on how to plan ahead for large load growth that we're going to briefly comment on as well. And we have, again, extracted a number of best practices on how to transparently incorporate distributed generation and storage in forecasts as well. What you see down here at the left were a couple of examples of end-use-based forecasts for EVs on the right and PV on the left coming out of Portland General Electric's 2023 IRP. I think I'm going to give it up to Puget Sound right now for an example of an application of load forecasting.
Good afternoon. This particular slide, I just wanted to show what we're doing in terms of climate change. So what our commission really encouraged us to look into issues related to climate change in our load forecasting, as well as the resource planning process. So I have both of those groups under me. So what we finally landed on was looking at some historical data, right? We used to just use the last historical 30 years for normal weather for a normal load forecast. But, you know, that obviously reflects whatever happened in the last 30 years. It doesn't reflect what's going to happen in the next 30. So we basically landed on using a few of the downscaled climate change models that we picked up from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, that the ones that they thought were good ones to be using. So we just piggybacked on their process to forecast how temperatures are going to change in the future. So we basically took the average of 3 of those models out into the future, and we're looking 15 years out and 15 years back. So, rather than just having a backwards look, which I kind of tend to think is a little bit more of a climate changed, not climate changing type approach. So we just kind of roll it forward every year. So we're a winter peaking utility. So, for us, warming means lowering load. So our normal load forecast drifts down as you go out into the future. Seemed like a nice way to blend what's happened recently, because some of these climate models you might not see some of the temperatures that we've seen in the recent past. So it seemed like a good way to manage those both. And that's really just to focus on the underlying temperature data. I mean, there's other components to the load forecast that JP mentioned, like new end uses. And is a couple of big ones. There's the electric vehicle forecast, which we've outsourced, and we incorporate both the forecast of electric vehicles as well as the potential to do demand response with that forecast. So for every EV forecast that we have a separate demand response potential for that forecast. And similarly, building electrification is a really tricky one to guess how that's going to unfold, but is a similar kind of approach that you can't just we have very small number of customers that appear to shift from gas to electric, and we're a combined utility, so we have some data on those migrations, but there's not very many, and depending on what happens with policies in our state, could see a lot more of that happening in the future. But you wouldn't want to use this very small number of customers right now. Is going to change significantly in the future. So we take up more of an end use sort of approach on those sorts of things.
All right, thanks, Phillip. Let me. So I think Phillip gave a great example of many of the best practices that we had uncovered, especially these 2 ones: develop a load forecast for expected future and planning effort for large load growth. As Phillip indicates, we find that end-use based bottom-up forecasts are the basis of best practices for load forecasting. These forecasts typically have hourly temporal resolution. In some cases, they are locationally also explicit. They're not a single system level forecast. They cover different zones that sometimes match the transmission layout, sometimes match resource availability layouts, but there are multiple ways in which utilities we see spreading not only over time, but also in space their forecasts. As Phillip also indicated, it is best practice to forecast separately the adoption, the operation, the flexibility of these resources, and characterizing and forecasting these requires specific methods, and they have to be clearly outlined separately as well in the report, so stakeholders can follow the logic on coming up with all those 3 that ultimately blend together to produce the actual forecast that goes into the models. In terms of large load best practice, as I mentioned, we have an entire best practice chapter on this, but some of the key elements that we have found is a need to collaborate with customers, with these large loads customers, to develop construction milestones that track how load materializes. This is the background here is the fear that utilities will have to deploy large expansion in their grids to absorb load that might or might not materialize. And so most of these large load best practices, point towards how to manage that uncertainty and mitigate the risk that comes with that. Another best practice is achieving win-win situations for system reliability and affordability by trying to work with customers to match and manage their timing of their deployments. And then use the scenario-based elements of IRP to bring this large load loads as part of the scenario planning and modeling. On the flexibility and the R forecast side, similarly, the best practices that we note are that demand-side resources should be integrated very transparently, and the flexibility of distributed generation and storage and all the demand-side resources has to also be characterized individually. Something that we noted is that, as you know, traditionally IRPs have used a market potential study to analyze the availability of energy efficiency and demand response to be used as a resource in IRP. We see that that tends to be the trend still, where and other types of new resources like EVs or heat pumps or other types of distributed energy resources are being reported as part of the IRP, which is interesting because it makes them more integrated right away. But we can see how in the future the market potential study could start hosting some of these other resources or vice versa. We're finding that best practices include adopting, forecasting the adoption of the ERs over time and space as the same way that we had seen end uses should be forecasted for native load. And typically adoption and operation follow some economic logic, but they're also influenced by policy and regulatory and retail right incentives. So it's important in the best practices that we notice how utilities outline specific policy and regulatory elements that are underpinning their adoption forecasts. The propensity of adoption methods looks to be a best practice for adoption. It's an algorithm, machine learning algorithm that can be used, especially when there's enough data available, fueled by AMI. We don't see clearly a best practice on how to model the operation of these distributed. In particular, what assumptions you make about the dispatchability and availability of EVs or heat pumps or other types of distributed generation. So this lends itself well to scenarios as these best practices coalesce. And finally, if there is a distribution system plan from which these DER forecasts are coming from or are used, it's important to make sure the IRP feeds from this DSP and they have similar and consistent assumptions. I'm going to give it back to Phillip to talk a little bit about flexibility in DER forecasts as they develop them in Puget Sound.
Great, thank you, JP. So what I just wanted to show here, this slide, if you've lived in IRP land, it's not, hopefully it's not that surprising. Well, we start with a load forecast before any incremental or additional conservation or demand response or distributed resource type measures. So we used to show the load forecast before conservation, kind of shorthand that description. But we found that a lot of stakeholders or especially public participants in the IRP process, they get a little agitated if you show a load forecast before conservation, but we treat conservation as a resource, right? We're looking for what's the cost-effective mix of supply side resources and demand side resources. So we have to start with the load forecast before all of that, and then it's treated in our portfolio modeling as a resource, just like a power plant is. So this is a capacity picture. So we chose a capacity picture to show in this regard so that it incorporates the effects of demand response. And that would include demand response, as I mentioned earlier, would include the demand response related to electric vehicles, right? And how we might be able to do demand response with those loads as well. So on a peak basis, you can see over the long run, you're actually saving quite a bit of capacity just by going with what's the cost-effective amount. So we give a lot more details in our IRP process, but kind of high level, I wanted to make sure that it was clear that the way we approach it is we start with the load forecast before conservation or other cost-effective demand side resources. Then we use the process to figure out what is cost-effective. That's how we've done it up till now. So.
Great. So now I'm going to talk about briefly our best practices on some supply side model inputs. So there are 7 best practices that we cover, and I will just cover a few of them right now. But these best practices cover assumptions around costs for new resources, timing of resource availability, resource integration costs, forward-going costs for existing resources, battery storage, and advanced and emerging technologies. And the general themes for these best practices are really to rely on the best available data, conduct studies where necessary to provide the best input information, avoid simplifying assumptions that might accidentally introduce bias or otherwise limit analysis and results. Give the model all of the information it needs to really make an optimized decision, so that optimized information can be used to inform the preferred portfolio selection. So the next slide, please. Great. So a couple of the best practices I want to highlight are around emerging and advanced technologies, since this is one of the newer issues that we address in the best practices report. So there can be substantial costs and risks associated with advanced technologies and limited market data, especially on technologies that are not currently commercially available or commercially deployed at scale by utilities. So it's a challenge for utilities, typical cat, challenge for utilities deciding which technologies to model, how to model them, how to reflect cost and risk in the model. Capacity expansion models, another issue is that a capacity expansion model can only make decisions based on the information given to them. So if there is a large amount of risk or uncertainty in a cost of a project, and that's not programmed into the model or tested in a sensitivity, that won't be reflected in the results. So some best practices that we recommend around advanced and emerging technologies are to model worst case scenarios around cost overruns to really account for the large uncertainty and risk with complex projects, to employ consistent and unbiased evaluation in choosing which technologies to include in an IRP, conducting studies outside of an IRP where necessary to inform inputs, and relying on reasonable timelines for deployment of emerging and advanced technologies. Next slide. The next two best practices I want to highlight are around how to address challenges with modeling renewables, so renewable integration costs specifically, and in capturing the value that battery energy storage can provide to the grid. So deployment of renewables can require grid services incremental to those that are already captured in capacity expansion and production cost modeling. And it's a challenge to figure out how to model those without double counting or without unnecessarily introducing cost, or alternatively, not capturing all of the services that the grid will actually need. On the flip side, energy storage is a really flexible resource that can add value to the system, but it can be challenging to model the full value stream and to capture all the values energy storage provides. So some best practices we recommend are around conducting external renewable integration studies that are synced up with the resource planning capacity expansion models, modeling integration costs across a range of portfolios and a range of points in time, and modeling the costs and capabilities of a range of short and long duration storage resources to determine which are the best fit for the utility. Next slide. Great. So the next set of model inputs I'll briefly address involve market integration, commodity prices, and transmission inputs. So these 5 best practices really address how the utility interacts with external entities and external markets, external commodity markets, and other utilities through transmission. So next slide. The first best practice I'll highlight here is around using reasonable market interaction assumptions. So balancing the benefits from market integration and also understanding the risk from assuming unnecessary high levels of market integration. And we recommend here conducting regional studies that align utility resource adequacy modeling with the capacity expansion assumptions. So understanding how much market energy is available by looking at regional studies. And I believe I'm going to pass this over to Phillip for an example.
Great. So in this slide, what I'm showing here is how we're integrating various factors into forecasting power prices. this is actually not you'd think this might be a stochastic distribution or something of prices, but it's actually just the annual distribution of a deterministic run. So under normal conditions and whatnot, right? And the way we develop those prices is we use the Aurora model to look at the entire Western interconnect. And then we focus on the mid-sea price up in our neck of the woods, up in the Pacific Northwest. So, but you can see what starts to happen out there in the future is you start to see prices diverging significantly at times when you're putting more and more intermittent resources on the grid, and there's times that the stars don't align, and the system is short, so you have to look for very expensive resources. So it is complicated in terms of the price forecasting to ensure that you're integrating all those variables. Like I said, we use the Aurora model to do that. We also use it for the deterministic prices as well the stochastic prices to do stochastic risk analysis. But then on the resource adequacy side, we also, I have a slide a little later on about resource adequacy, but really big picture, we are looking at a challenge in our region. We are like a little load pocket in the BPA's system, so the Bonneville Power Administration. So they're big. They own 80% of the transmission in the region, and we're kind of behind them. So we are very conscious in both our resource adequacy modeling as well as our portfolio modeling to be taking account of what we can import into not just the region, but into our bubble of the region. And additionally, we have been very short capacity. We've been short capacity for, I've actually, my background, I'm a little older than what my picture might show. But we've been short capacity for a very long time because our region has been surplus. So for a long time, it didn't really make sense for us to build a lot of power plants to cover that open position. And just for context, right now, we have about a 6,000 megawatt planning target, including a planning reserve margin. We've had about 1,500 megawatts of transmission to the other side of the mountains or to the market that doesn't have a long-term firm resource behind it. And for decades, that was a fantastic deal for our customers because we didn't have to build a power plant. Now, the public power agencies that own a lot of the dams on the Columbia River, they weren't so keen with that idea because they felt like we weren't paying them any kind of capacity charge for buying their market on the wholesale. And that was true. And that was fine for my customers. That was great. But now that the region is no longer looking like it's surplus, in fact, we're about to go capacity deficit, we're very, very conscientious. That 1,500 megawatts that we've had to rely on short-term market, we've basically, that's disappeared in our planning. So like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about resource adequacy in a little while. But I just wanted to make the point here that for both forecasting prices, I guess there's really three places. Forecasting prices, we reflect the interconnected nature of the different energy markets, as well as transmission limits. We do that with the resource adequacy, and we also do that in the portfolio modeling, because it's just really important to be comfortable that you can import the resources that you think you can import. So we reflect it in all three pieces.
Great. Thanks for that, Phillip. Okay, so the last input I'm going to go through quickly in the name of time is our best practices around modeling fuel inputs, particularly in modeling limitations in fuel supply and evaluating the impacts of volatility in gas and coal prices. The best practices that we outline here in the report deal with how to address weather-correlated outages and addressing that through either capital investments required to address weatherization issues or through capacity deratings. conducting stochastic risk analysis to evaluate how volatility in fuel prices impacts the optimal portfolio, and then generally evaluating how reduced reliance on fossil fuel resources through resource planning can reduce the volatility and the risk inherent in reliance on volatile inputs. I'll now kick it to Shelley to go through designing scenarios and sensitivities.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, I'll dive right in. So chapter 4 of our report has 3 best practices related to designing scenarios and sensitivities. These cover topics such as how to set up a good base case and how to design scenarios to evaluate an appropriate range of uncertainty, risk, and regulatory factors. Next slide. So we included these best practices because we recognize that there are a lot of common challenges that planners will face during the scenario design process, including the tension between wanting to model a full and comprehensive range of uncertainties versus also the need to produce clear and informative results in a report of a reasonable length. This can be challenging when planners need to balance stakeholder requests for certain scenarios with their own utility priorities, as well as any commission requirements for specific scenarios that need to be included in the filing. Another challenge we've noticed is that some scenario design may depend on whether the focus is on minimizing shareholder risks versus minimizing ratepayer costs from a scenario design perspective. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about some of the best practices to help this process. So we recommend modeling a good base case that allows for easy comparison. And what that means is setting up a base case such that other scenarios and sensitivities are internally consistent and results can be readily compared across them. Best practice 29 talks about how to design an appropriate range of scenarios that focuses on evaluating real and likely futures to ensure that the results are useful for IRP purposes. This is because there are endless numbers of scenarios that would be interesting to model, and it's important for planners and stakeholders to prioritize the ones that are going to help inform a preferred portfolio and a near-term action plan. Next slide. So we also include a specific best practice about modeling regulatory uncertainty. Best practice in this regard is to model all final, proposed, and likely regulations in some manner in the IRP to allow for time for proactive planning and the identification of no regrets actions. Depending on the certainty of the regulations, planners may opt to model some of these in the base case, whereas it might make sense for others to be modeled through additional scenarios or sensitivities. Specifically, when it comes to finalized regulations, though, best practice would be to model compliance in the base case to ensure that the utility is planning ahead appropriately. But where there's more uncertainty, planners may opt to analyze alternative futures with varying levels of regulations through a scenario or sensitivity analysis. Ultimately, the goal is to use the modeling tools to understand what is likely to happen in the future and which regulatory factors can have the largest impact on results. And we highlight that not modeling the impacts at all of proposed or likely regulations would not be best practice, as it could lead to costly decisions and delays. And with that, I will pass it to JP.
All right, we have a 20% of those practices in this report focus on modeling. As you folks know, modeling is one of the core activities within IRP. So in that sense, I can't explain them in detail. These practices cover aspects related to calibrating and choosing models, selecting the appropriate geographic and temporal resolution for the models, and a specific best practice on how to balance the desire to for certain decisions in the models versus letting the models optimize around certain decisions. And then practices related to capturing the value storage and using stochastic approaches to test portfolios. Perhaps one of the contributions that we do in this work is related to this diagram that shows how the different pieces and models in IRP relate to each other and to key parts of the process, like scenarios and sensitivities and the creation of the portfolio. Perhaps one of the aspects that I will highlight is that one best practice is minimizing the amount of decisions that are forced into models, either construction decisions or retirement decisions, and letting the capacity expansion model, once calibrated with the appropriate forward-looking costs for all resources, including those that might be subject to retirement, letting the model decide what is the appropriate economic decision to make, and then testing the outcomes of the decisions, of course, through different scenarios. The other important thing I'm going to highlight is, as you see here in this diagram, there are several arrows that go back and iterate. And so the iterative use of models is one thing that it's pretty important, as we have discovered. And to exemplify this, we're going to focus a little bit in the way resource adequacy models should interact with capacity expansion models, and then use some of Puget Sound's experience as an example. So in the space of resource adequacy analysis, there's been a whole lot of work in what are best practices and emerging best practices to improve resource adequacy assessments, and especially from a methodological and metrics perspective. So what we focused on these best practices was, we connected and linked those available studies in our report, but we focus on the way and best practices related to how to bring resource adequacy assessments into the resource planning process more effectively. And so some of the best practices that we cover here relate to integrating the resource adequacy assessment iteratively with the capacity expansion model. The need to apply consistent accreditation frameworks, so essentially applying ELCCs across the board, across technologies, and not picking certain methods to accredit resources based on their technology. And then another important best practices that emerged was to take a regional perspective on resource adequacy rather than treating the utility sort of as a sole autarkic entity, but also based on historical patterns of capacity needs being fulfilled through imports or potentially through exports to other entities, then use those and reflect those in the model. And I'm going to pass it to Phillip for a really brief recap of how Puget Sound implements some of these models.
Great, thank you, JP. I just want to mention, I really like the way you describe the iterative nature of the models. I think a lot of times you hear people say the model, and there isn't the model, there isn't one. It's a set of models, right? And we have a group of analytical artists that are really good at using all those models in concert for a process. So that I really like that notion of the iterative nature of all those models. So for us, I mentioned this briefly earlier. What we've done, so this is an example from our 23, we'll call it an IRP, but it was a little IRP that wound up being a great big IRP anyway. It was supposed to be an electric progress report, but it was actually a full IRP. So basically, we look at, if we start all the way over on the right, and I'm sorry, if it would have been a map instead of an analytical process, it might have made a little bit more sense. But we've used E3 in our last IRP process to help us do the resource adequacy analysis, and using tools and a process that we had put together a few years ago. And what we start with, really, there's what happens in our region, which here is in our BA, in our balancing authority, is the recap, what they're calling the recap E3 model. You could think of that as our balancing authority. So the resources that I have in my balancing authority to serve my load, and the resources that I have with dedicated long haul transmission to bring those resources into our balancing authority. So there's the bubble of what happens in the PSE bubble. And then as you go over to the left, there's something called the wholesale purchase curtailment model, and then this Genesis BPA, it's the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's model. So to simulate the region. So basically, we're looking at what's going on in the region. And again, that's really important for us. I'm sure it's important for everybody, but it's extra special for important for us because we're 1,500 megawatts short on capacity. And again, for decades, we've had these studies from the Power Planning Council that look out five years or so, look like everything's fine. So no need to go out there and incur the expense of building a new power plant. But we don't know that until you study it, right? So, but as it starts getting shorter, what you'll see, even if the region is fine, let's say your 1 in 10 LOLE, your loss of load expectation, let's say that's your standard, you're going to have misses. There will be misses, right? You're not planning for perfect reliability. And so what the thing in the middle, it really reflects a kind of a combination of our transmission import limits, but then also if there's a shortfall in the region, that's gonna we don't assume that PSE will have to bear that entire shortfall because there's other utilities in the region that are also short. And so we've basically this wholesale purchase curtailment model. What that really does is it kind of allocates the shortage in a particular draw or simulation. It allocates that to PSE. So it really reflects this wholesale purchase curtailment model. It kind of winds up incorporating basically the transmission import limits as well as what happens if there's not enough supply behind that transmission to the region. So that's how we kind of make sure that we're connecting up to the bigger region. That can we continue to rely on the wholesale market or not? It's really important to us since we are so dependent on it to meet our reliability criteria.
Great, thanks, Phil, for that explanation and example from Puget Sound. I'm going to jump in right now. We did get one question coming in on the Q&A function. I want to, of course, invite our entire audience to submit their questions as they pop into your minds. But I thought I'd go ahead and ask this one now, and then we can go back to the slides presentation. So the question is, when you discuss modeling regulatory uncertainty, are you also thinking about potential state policy changes that are not necessarily regulatory?
Yeah, I can take that one.
Great, thanks, Devi.
Yes, and when we talk about regulatory uncertainty, we mean everything. So whether it's a state policy, a state requirement, federal, anything that's legal, lawful, or otherwise the utility needs to comply with can be modeled in the IRP. There are various ways to do that in an IRP model, whether it's through programs or through programming in certain amounts of generation or certain penalty costs. Anything that is required, no matter what level it's at, can be incorporated.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. And I'll turn it back to you guys to continue going through the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks. And yeah, that question will actually be relevant to a slide that we'll get to in just a few moments about the preferred portfolio. So diving right in to the results evaluation, we include a handful of best practices that talk about how to evaluate portfolio results and communicate them transparently to regulators and stakeholders. So if we go to the next slide, I'd like to focus on best practice 41, which talks about how to define appropriate metrics for evaluating results. In our review of IRPs, we noticed that utilities often use something like a scorecard or a matrix to help summarize the results across all of the scenarios that they modeled and allow for easier comparison. And this requires selecting certain metrics to highlight for the report. And so here we say that a best practice would be that if a utility is going to use a scorecard approach in its IRP report, it really should develop the metrics in collaboration with stakeholders and regulators at the beginning of the IRP process, ensuring transparency so that the chosen metrics don't end up skewing the results in a certain direction that's not necessarily aligned with the region-specific needs and goals. And so a utility that is currently doing this well is AES Indiana. we reviewed one of AES Indiana's prior IRPs where the utility actually developed scorecard metrics that were developed as part of a task force that was created by the state's General Assembly. And this task force was focused on creating a set of pillars for electric utility service specifically. So I felt like this was a good example of alignment across different proceedings in a state. Next slide. Yeah, so the preferred portfolio is an important step of the IRP process as it helps guide near-term actions such as procurement and helps stakeholders and regulators focus their feedback and oversight. And so the best practices in the report for selecting the preferred portfolio is to justify any substantial deviations between an optimized portfolio that was produced as part of the modeling process versus the selected preferred portfolio. We also dissuade resource planners from kind of cherry picking or developing by hand a preferred portfolio outside of the model, since that can lead to results that are not subject to the same level of rigorous analysis as the rest of the scenarios. And then lastly, this kind of aligns with the question that we got, which is that the preferred portfolio should be in compliance with state goals, priorities, as well as regulations that are in place. And I think with that, that brings us to the end of our slides, and we have a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. There aren't any in the Q&A feature right now, but I have a few that I can pose if you'll indulge me. I really want to ask about Devi's cat, but I'm going to stay focused on IRP instead. So as a regulator, I was curious, are there best practices that are good to prioritize for a utility or their regulator to prioritize in this process? And along the same track, are there best practices that are kind of the low-hanging fruit that we can do quickly and efficiently and get that motivation to keep on, improving the process as we go along?
I can take a stab at that. I think we had at some point a discussion about can we extract, and this is something we thought about in terms of trying to summarize best practices as we present them, because we have never been able to sit in a webinar and do all 50 of them. And what we kind of realize is that it's really up to each jurisdiction to find what are the priority best practices that they need to emphasize. For example, something that I spoke to, load growth. Load growth is indeed showing up across the country, but there are regions where it is really a sort of critical need, where large amounts of data centers and other types of industrial loads are wanting to gain interconnection, whereas in other places, things are slower. And so you would imagine that those places, if they have IRP, they would try to tap into some of the best practices related to load. I would say there are some shared principles that we don't outline specifically, perhaps in the intro of our report, that we don't quite bring in here, related to transparency, for example. So there is no loss in being transparent about the calculations that you're putting forth, the assumptions that are being used, and the models that are being used, because that's the only way in which stakeholders can really gain a good perspective on the IRP and are able to interact with it on a more or less equal level. Iteration is another thing that's relatively low-hanging fruit. We see in best practice that it goes a long way to iterate models and to make sure that the results of those iterations are sort of converge towards a result that is, especially when you're trying to aim for a best sort of preferred portfolio. It takes some time to iterate, but it can be automated in several ways, and it can be implemented, as we saw in many utilities in our best practices analysis. So it's also a way in which you can take the existing models and just articulate them in a way that can yield much improved results.
Thanks, JP. We just got a question in. Oh, Phillip, did you want to add something on that?
What I was going to just add is, in Washington, so the law changed twice last year for what me and my group have to do, right? And then it's the one of the right one was a law, then there was a ballot initiative to not just overturn the law that was passed, but make some line item vetoes to individual statutes. So our commission is in the same position we are. They're trying to create rules for the old law. Then there's a ballot initiative that does some line item vetoes, which of course is being challenged in court, right? So we're not quite sure what's going on with it. But one of the really good things, I think, that the initial law, which is referred to as House Bill 1589, it, at least for Puget Energy, it moved us into an integrated system planning process. But one of the really important pieces of that is our commission will now have to approve or reject or approve with changes, right? Our IRP. So in the past, it's really just been a review process. It's a compliance filing, and we file it and it's done. And the challenge that I've felt like for now, I've been kind of in the IRP group basically for 20 years. It's been very difficult because external stakeholders want way more engagement than we can possibly do. Because we're trying to do all of this complex analysis and present it as we go, there's no time to be able to have a dialogue about the way that people want to have. And so I think one of the things that we're going to find that's been great about that change in the law is there's now going to be some structured process that we can do our work and file something at the commission. Then there's an opportunity for the commission to issue protective orders if we have some confidential information that we need to protect. And then we can share data with the different folks that are a party to the proceeding. And there's an orderly process so that then the interveners can take a look at the data. They can run models and then they can kind of give it back to us. So there's an orderly process to that transition. So I think one of the big challenges that we've had in the past, it was really that our people that are engaging in this, they want all this data. They want to be able to do things sort of contemporaneous with us, but they need us to help them. But I can't do discovery and training and deciphering what did you do versus what we did without that sort of formal structure. So that I think is one really good one, is that if you don't approve, if state doesn't approve the IRPs and inter or parties are agitated that they don't have enough access to information and process, I think it really is the process was a little too loose before. I think it's going to be improved quite a bit. So that would be my one.
Well, thank you for that perspective from somebody who's on the presentation side of the IRP instead of the evaluating side, like I am. We had two questions pop up. I like both of them. Depending on what else, I can stick around past 4 if questions keep coming in. I don't know about the panelists. We want to be respectful of everybody's time. Right now, we just have these 2, and this might close us out. The first one is, how do you suggest handling or justifying build limits in modeling?
Yeah, I can handle this one. So this comes up
Great.
a lot, and that was one of the actually best practices we skipped on account of time today. Okay. So build limits are there's multiple ways to address them. So first, when you do scenarios, you should model scenarios with and without build limit. So if you think there's a real reason that you can't bring online more than a certain amount of resources, a specific resource in a year, model a scenario with that limit, and then model a scenario without that limit. That's the key, because if your model builds up to the limit, that's that message that's telling you is that, well, the model will build as much as it can until it stops artificially. Secondary is when you do your short-term action plan, when you go to the market, when you go to procure energy, if you've limited how much the model can build, well, don't limit that in your RFP. If a resource is economic, then when you issue your RFPs, when you go to the market, don't limit them the same way you have in the model. Say, okay, let's see what the market can produce. One of the values in doing the optimized runs that remove the limit is it's sending a message to the market that not that the utility is interested in only a small amount, but that this resource is economic. And if the market can provide this much or as much as possible, the utility will go after it. So really it's balancing, understanding both what happens if you have a limit, but not limiting your actual procurement, your actual messages to the market based on that.
Thank you, Devi, for that. And we've got one last question here, and I'm super excited because it's from my awesome colleague, Commissioner Wes Bennett. And Commissioner Bennett asks if there is a role for AI in the process used by the utility and or the regulatory body.
I can take a stab at that. So first, there is a major role. It's increasing load growth significantly. So that's already happening. But in terms of applications, so depending on how you define AI, there are already machine learning algorithms that are used in several types of models within IRP, particularly load forecasting. So there has been, for a few years now, small applications. Now, one that I can think of a large language model like ChatGPT, for example, is that IRP produces thousands of pages documents. You could ingest all these into a large language model and ask clever questions that might assist significantly regulators in inspecting these documents. And you could be targeting and calibrating these models to be specifically aligned with, for example, the kinds of structures and taxonomies that we build in our report. So the model knows what to expect in terms of an IRP. The model even could be calibrated with the best practices. And you can ask the model, tell me how many best practices are met in this particular report and what is the level between 1 to 10 of meeting them. And there could be ways in which these best practices could be used to actually calibrate an AI that can give a first pass to study models. But as I mentioned, there are several other applications on the forecasting side, on the simulation side that could emerge soon to improve the modeling side of IRP. And I don't know if any of my colleagues have ideas on how that can happen in addition to that, but that will be one application for AI models.
Great. Well, thank you, JP. Phil, yeah.
I was just going to add that I think that when you talk to folks that do IRPs, we can't answer all the questions we have. There's just no possible way we could do it. So I think that over time, AI is going to allow us to ask and answer deeper and deeper and deeper questions, which is going to be important because we're creating a system in the future that's more and more difficult to manage. So hopefully the technology of analyzing what we need to do will keep up with the challenges of the system that we're building in the future.
Shelley or Devi, anything you want to add? And if not, I'll turn it back to Jeff for housekeeping and to close us out. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you to all of you for your really perceptive and valuable and informative comments. Really appreciate it. I found that last discussion about AI really interesting, JP. Maybe we'll sit down and talk about that at some point in time. And I also will put a plug in for the report for one of the sections that we didn't have time to get to about integrating IRP with other utility proceedings. One of my areas of focus is on distribution system planning, and we're also kicking off a bit of a comprehensive planning initiative at NARUC, or revisiting one from a few years ago, actually. And the importance of connecting IRP modeling with other types of modeling relevant to utility operation is something that's getting more and more attention. And so if you're interested in that, I certainly encourage you to look at those practices in the report as well. Thank you to Commissioner Freeman. Thank you to JP and Devi and Shelley and Phillip for sharing their expertise and their time with us this afternoon. As Jessica said, you will find the presentations and the recording on our website shortly. You should be able to get the contact information for all of our speakers if you want to follow up with them from that presentation. They are included there. And we wish you a good rest of your day and a good rest of your week. And we look forward to seeing you on future innovation webinars and NARUC events. Take care, everyone. Thank you.